It really is a hectic time since we have to deal with the the new toys with Zoom and all that. But glad to see that you guys made it here with the new link. So this is going to be a little bit different since we don't have it set up as a webinar, since the original link had some trouble. So it's sort of a regular meeting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post a link in the chat for you guys to ask questions. So this is going to be a Google Doc. And essentially, if you have a question during the session, I'll ask that you just sort of go ahead and put it in that Google Doc, and then we'll go ahead and look at it at the ends when we have our normal Q&A session. And if there's a particular med mentor that you have a question specifically for, just put like at Emma or at Vishnu in front of it, and we'll try to make sure that we can get that answered for you at the very end. But yeah, so hopefully everyone has the agenda as well. Let me get that just sort of put in the chat, make sure we're all good, and then we will get started. And while I'm doing that, maybe Emma, could you start us off with a brief intro into maybe undergrad and how many gap years you took, and then popcorn it off to Vishnu?
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. My name is Emma. I am a current MS1. I went to Yale University, but that feels kind of like ages ago to me because I graduated back in 2016. So I took 4 gap years off. And during that time, I worked at NYU at their School of Medicine in their Center for Healthcare Innovation and Delivery Science. And I was sort of a program manager over there working on clinical quality improvement work, healthcare innovation research, and things like that. So Vishnu, popcorn.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vishnu. I graduated from UC Berkeley in 2018. I studied economics at Berkeley, but during my gap years, I worked as a clinical research coordinator at UCSF Radiology for 2 years. And so there I was primarily coordinating the regulatory aspects, patient visit scheduling, data entry for a lot of clinical trials, particularly in nuclear medicine, but in other aspects of radiology as well.
All right, awesome. And you guys may know me from previous sessions with Med Mentors. I'm an MS2. I also went to Berkeley, so go Bears. Graduated in December 2018 and took a semester off before starting med school. So I might be able to speak to some points, but Emma and Vishnu are going to be our stars today. We did have Anwesha scheduled to join us as well today, but I think she's feeling a little under the weather. So we'll send her our best wishes and sort of carry on in the meantime. So the first item on our list is really about sort of the myths of gap years. So I think as medical students, looking back, like we heard a ton of things about what, like, should we take a gap year, should we not? What should we do with a gap year if we're going to take one, and all that kind of stuff. So maybe Vishnu or Emma, have you had any of those sort of instances where someone told you about it, and then looking back, you sort of were like, oh, that's not really true?
Yeah, yes, definitely. I think the biggest misnomer about gap years is that as soon as you take a gap year in your application cycle, you're referred to as a non-traditional student. But I really think that that's a huge misnomer at this point, because the vast majority of people that are in our class, and Vishnu, you can speak to this as well, but the vast majority of people have taken at least 1 year off. It is pretty unusual. There's some of all kinds, but I think it's pretty unusual to find like a large group of people that have gone straight through. So I think initially I was nervous to take time off because it was labeled with this sort of non-traditional look to it. And with that label came what I think is the other big misnomer, which is that you kind of like set yourself back, or you might start off behind if you take a gap year. But I actually think that couldn't be further from the truth. I think it's the complete opposite. I think you actually put yourself ahead if you take a gap year, because you take time to learn the world that your patients are going to be living in, time not as a student, living in a normal apartment, working a job, paying your taxes, paying rent, things like that, just the day-to-day life that all of your patients are going to be experiencing. So yeah, I think those are the two biggest things. It is certainly not non-traditional at this point, and you certainly will not be behind no matter how many years you take.
Yeah, I would completely agree with what Emma said. I think most people in our class have taken at least one gap year, and I think nationally that's also the trend, is for people to start taking more time off between undergrad and medical school. And I think taking gap years, I think, also gives you a lot of skills that you wouldn't have otherwise learned in undergrad. I think personally for me, navigating a workplace and a 9 to 5 job, sleeping like an adult instead of like a college student, and having a regular sleep schedule, working in a hierarchy, so working with the supervisor and with the supervisor's supervisor and knowing how to navigate that situation. Whereas in college, you're not really managed. You do things because you want to do them. Whereas when you're working in a hierarchy, which is the nature of the real world, it's a completely different frame altogether. I think also, like Emma said, like being able to earn money, save up for, medical school applications is also a huge plus. And also just being able to explore things that you might not have been able to explore in undergrad. So for me in undergrad, I was kind of jumping all over the place between some teaching, some econ policy work, and then I pivoted again during my gap years to clinical research. And I liked that I had that opportunity to do something that I didn't before. And I think it really broadened my perspective on how I wanted to, or what sorts of things I wanted to do as a medical student, and how that would inform my career path moving forward. So I think that there are so many advantages, and you definitely will not feel left out or behind if you come to medical school after taking gap years, because that's really the norm moving forward.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think if you look at sort of national statistics for the US, actually about 62% of students that are entering medical school at any given time now are coming in with at least one gap year under their belt. So the majority of students are actually having that experience. And definitely when I was applying, I was so stressed about the idea that I would be sort of spending time between finishing undergrad and starting medical school, because I was like, this path is already such a long one with medical school and then adding sort of like residency and then fellowship on top of it. And I was very scared to sort of spend an additional amount of time splitting between those two things. But I would completely agree with what Emma and Vishnu said, that the gap years are really opportunities to sort of explore things and get a sense of activities or parts of normal living that you don't really have as an undergraduate student. And it certainly is an interesting experience as well. That's sort of like once in a lifetime. There's also one thing I wanted to say, and I heard a really cool quote from another student in one of the previous sessions, in that there's sort of a movement where gap years are now sort of being referred to as enrichment years instead of gap years, because the term gap has this connotation of it being sort of like a split in time between when you are doing one thing versus another. But the enrichment year means that you're spending it doing something incredibly productive and something that will benefit you in the long run. So I would encourage you, if someone tells you that gap years are like a waste of time, then maybe suggest to them that they should think of it as an enrichment year instead. But certainly in the end, it will be up to sort of you and your timeline and pathway. So thank you guys for answering that. So one myth is a myth, but I'm curious to hear sort of your thoughts, Emma and Vishnu. Is that for gap years that you have to spend it somewhere different than you were for undergrad. So if you went to say UCLA, that if you stayed at UCLA, it might be seen as sort of like a period of stagnation. So what are your guys' thoughts on that?
No, I don't think that's true at all. We have a lot of classmates. I mean, especially in the UC system. I'm new to the UC system. I'm from Manhattan, New York, so this is new for me. But we have a lot of kids in our class who went to UCLA and now are here, and went to UCLA and worked at UCLA and now are here. I mean, I think, yeah, I don't think that the location that you go matters in terms of like your ability to get in or not, as long as you are actually passionate about the work that you're doing. Like, I think that's the key. Like, your gap year or years And I'm like this, it's my favorite decision that I've ever made in my life was to take a gap year. So I'm like very pro gap year, but your gap years will never be a waste of time as long as you're passionate about the things that you're doing. So I don't think at all that it's a disadvantage to stay in one place in terms of applications. Personally, I chose to move from the institution that I was at because I wanted to be in different places, and I'm also from New York and I wanted to go home. But I've never heard of an admissions person thinking negatively about staying on as long as you're passionate about the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I completely agree as well. I wasn't aware that that was a myth that
Yeah.
existed, that you kind of had to stay or move to a different location. I think a lot of kids from Berkeley personally will choose to work at UCSF because, you know, they still want to live in Berkeley or Emeryville or somewhere nearby, and they can commute to San Francisco for work. So a lot of it's dependent on kind of where do you want to stay, where do you have family nearby, and then they make their decisions based on that. So I don't think a school would view it negatively if you went to a nearby institution or the same institution. It's all about kind of where do you want to stay, where are the job opportunities that you really want, and like that's really how I made my decision.
Thank you. Yeah, for my gap semester, I stayed on at Berkeley doing research. So, and here I am. So I would say like, certainly don't ever feel like your selection of what you do or where you are for a gap year or an enrichment year is restricted at all. Like really, it should be more tailored to your interests and what you want to do. So another thing that I've heard, and I'll let you guys weigh in on this as well, is sort of, it pertains to the duration of the gap per se between starting medical school and ending undergrad and starting medical school. And I've heard people say like, oh, you don't want to go over 1 year or max 2 years, because if you do that, then you're too far removed from like studying and it'll be too hard to get back into things. So what are your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, Vishnu, do you want to go first? Or I took 4 years. So, I mean, I hesitated. I thought initially when I left school that I was only going to take 2 years. 2 years seems like I think that's like the most common period of time that I hear from people is 2 years. But I loved the work that I was doing, and I felt like the work that I was doing was really productive and important. So I didn't want to leave it. I wasn't ready to. But yeah, I don't think, people do hesitate to go over that 2 year mark, but I think it's totally arbitrary. I did not take the Mcat until year 3 of my gap year, and I'm here. So it was okay. I wasn't so far removed from school that I couldn't do it anymore. And, it comes back to you. I think the more time you take, the better, personally. I needed that time after undergrad. I needed to take that time to like be my own person, live as a real person in the real world and not a student. I needed that. And I wouldn't change it. I think it's put everything into such better perspective for me. Makes school seem so much less like looming and stressful and scary when you realize that just nobody else in the world is worrying about that day to day. So yeah, I think you will get pushback internally, like against going, more than 2 years, but I don't think that there's anything to like any true substance to that. And you can totally do it as long as you want to. You can do it. And we have someone in our class who's like 35 or something, right, Vishnu?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
A few, I think, actually.
yeah, I think you're right. I think a few. So yeah.
Yeah, I would also completely agree with that statement as well. I think that, the notion that if you come back to med school after several years, you're going to fall behind, you're going to struggle. One thing to keep in mind, most med schools are pass, not pass the first couple of years. And so there's time to kind of experiment with different study strategies and think about what works best for you, what doesn't work so well. Studying in med school is completely different from studying in undergrad. And I realized just how poor my study habits were in undergrad and what a lack of planning I had compared to how purposeful I am about my study strategies now. And the nice thing is that it is pass, not pass. And so, you're not competing with the rest of your class, it's you versus you. So being able to have that environment where, you have some room to make mistakes and to learn what works best for you is really important. And then we also have really good support and advising. I know, like for those of us that went to these larger schools, Berkeley, UCLA, like academic advising isn't really a thing that we're used to engaging with on a regular basis. Whereas here, I get like one-on-one appointments with our academic advisor. I've met her like at least twice, I think, so far to go over study strategies and things like that. And so there is a really strong support system in med school compared to what I experienced in undergrad. And I think the environment of it being pass, not pass, and the fact that the professors don't really expect you to come in having a strong prior background in XYZ. Like we know that everybody comes in with different backgrounds in different parts of healthcare. And so I think med school is also really good at bringing people from different academic backgrounds together. So whether you're straight out of school or several years out, you're still going to have that opportunity to catch up and perform as well as you want.
Yeah, definitely. I think in our class, we have sort of a similar gamut, and there's some people coming straight from college directly to medical school, and then some people have taken several years. I think there might even be a person who, I think there was one person who did a PharmD before coming to medical school as well. So it's like there are so many different things that can happen, and there's so many different timelines. And I think as long as it makes the most sense for you and what you want to do, that's really all that anyone could ask for. I do want to answer a question quickly. I think there was one specifically coming in for me about what a half gap year means. I should have specified that I did a double major at Berkeley and two engineering majors, and so I took an additional semester. So the semester after that was just sort of a time for me to do some research and enjoy the fact that I was not killing myself with undergrad classes. But yeah, we have one for Emma as well, but I think that will actually fit very well into sort of the next section, which we're going to go into right now, which is about sort of what things do people do during the gap years. So maybe we can start, Emma, if you could give us sort of a rundown about how your 4 years were spent, sort of what led you to sort of take that path, and then we'll popcorn over to Vishnu.
Yeah. So I worked at this place called the Center for Healthcare Innovation and Delivery Science, which is it's like a center that works in a branch of health services research, where we look at, generally as a center, we look at the way that care is administered and what steps we can take to improve that administration of care. And importantly, that means, not just for the patient's experience of receiving the care, but also for the providers who are giving the care. And so that was a big focus of my my group that I worked in. I was hired on actually as an intern during the summer after my junior year of college to work with the founder of the center. And then they hired me directly as a research associate when I graduated. And I worked specifically in a group that looked at the radiology spectrum at NYU and how we could best improve, imaging appropriateness, follow-up timeliness, like all of these sort of different metrics that are involved in radiology as a whole. And if anybody's interested in healthcare innovation as a concept, I'm happy to talk your ear off about this if you want. You can reach out. I'm sure we'll give our emails at the end. But so I did that. And then at 2 years, when I thought I was the program manager who was running my grant at the time, left and I was offered her job. So I stayed. I stayed for 2 years. And so I ended up running the grant for my director. And that's what I did for 4 years until the grant ended. And then I came to school. So that's in a nutshell what we did. There's a lot to it, and it's a sector of research that is kind of a newly growing field, so not that many people know too much about it. But if anybody has any questions that they want to ask me about that, I'm happy to answer. So yeah, that's what I did.
I would say for me, my gap year path and sort of how I chose my job was a little less planned. I think after I took my Mcat post-graduation, I was completely burnt out and tired. So I traveled to India for a month to spend time with extended family. And then I came back and started looking for jobs. And I chose radiology because it's the first place they gave me an interview and then a job offer. And so I was interested in doing some sort of clinical research work because I hadn't done clinical research before. And so I didn't really lean one way or another in terms of what sort of specialty or department I wanted to go into. And so radiology I thought was interesting. So I started there a few months after graduating. And so I worked primarily, like I said, on regulatory aspects of filling out institutional review board applications for studies, consenting patients, so reading them their rights as part of participation in clinical trials, data entry, coordinating study visits with patients, so scheduling their visits, making sure they know where to go for all of their appointments. And so more on the administrative side. And specifically the trials I was working on were imaging studies in nuclear medicine. So how well certain PET imaging agents detect prostate cancer in patients, and therapeutic trials about how certain nuclear medicine therapies treat prostate cancer in the similar patient population as well. And so it was really interesting work. And I sort of jumped into radiology sort of serendipitously, but then I really enjoyed the trials that I was working on, the PIs that I was working with, and UCLA actually has a really strong nuclear medicine department as well. So we used to collaborate with them a good amount. I would say probably the toughest part of my job was towards the end of my time there when the FDA came to inspect one of our trials because we had submitted an application to get our study drug approved. And so that was it was stressful because we realized how many problems there were that predated my time at UCSF.
Oh man, that's like my worst nightmare as a project coordinator.
Somehow we passed. And I continue
Well
to believe
done.
it because the FDA auditor was very nice. I give a lot of credit to how nice the auditor was for a lot of our things, but it was a regulatory nightmare, but we got through it, we passed. And so now I'm looking forward to that drug being approved, and then hopefully more centers can start using that sort of imaging for prostate cancer. But it was something that I didn't think too much about when I was choosing jobs, but it's something that I really want to continue being involved in.
You do not have to do something involved with radiology if you're doing your gap years. I have no intention to go into radiology. I'm not interested in radiology as a specialty. I'm interested in healthcare innovation as a concept. And in our work, it was actually more about the referring specialties that we're working with radiology. But yeah, despite this very tiny sample size, you don't have to pick radiology. There's plenty of other things to do out there. And you also don't have to pick research. That's the other thing, I think, because I think that was part of your question, Ryan. It doesn't have to be research. I think like what I said in the beginning holds true. As long as you are passionate about what you're doing, and that passion can come from either interest or necessity, right? Like some people need to take time off because they need to be able to save up some money before they go to medical school. And that is a totally legitimate reason to need to take time off. Medical school is expensive. Life is expensive. People take time for any number of reasons. And I think that all of those things are fine as long as you are able to explain why it is that you're doing what you're doing. I think that admissions is going to be totally fine with it. So research is a common one that you'll hear because there are a lot of jobs in research and you can get into it as an entry level, but it's certainly not alone. There's a lot of medical scribes in our class, a lot of former healthcare consultants. But I tend to think that the more off the beaten path you can go, the better, because then you really stand out. But that's its own thing.
Certainly. Yeah, I will make the sample size of n equals 2 to go to n equals 3 and say that during my semester off, I also participated in some radiology research at UCSF with PET imaging and sort of designing an algorithm to try to better tailor treatment plans for patients getting re-irradiation plans.
Which
Sorry?
which PI did you work for?
I worked with Dr. Anwar, Mikhail Anwar.
Who?
Mikhail Anwar at UCSF in the radiation oncology department.
Oh, radiation oncology. Okay, I've not heard of them.
Yeah, but I also did some projects related to the research that I had been doing during undergrad with micro robotics and microfluidics, because I'm all about the tiny world within the macroscopic world. So really, like Emma and Vishnu were saying, there's so many opportunities that you can take and so many reasons that people take gap years. Research is definitely a common one. Postbacks, like with NIH, I think are very common sort of in that sphere. Many people go for jobs. And one myth that I'd like to bust is that your gap year has to be medically related. I think a lot of students, they think like, oh, you know, if I have plans to go to medical school and I have plans to do a gap year, logically to make that story be contiguous and logical, I have to have that time be spent doing something inherently medically related. And you can be doing something totally different. I think sort of piggybacking on what Emma was saying, for me, the two criteria that I think you should ask yourself about what you're doing or what you want to do during a gap/enrichment year is one, is it something of interest or you're following your passions? And then the other, is it productive and something that sort of follows your story? And if the answer is yes to both of those questions, I think that's, you can definitely talk about it and it'll make complete sense and no one could ever fault you for spending your time doing that. So, you have anything else, Vishnu?
Nothing else.
All right. I guess, so in your gap year periods, what was like the best thing about it and the worst thing, like the polar ends of the spectrum? Like maybe Vishnu, you can start us off for that one.
Yeah, I would say the best thing was, like, I think different from like the frame has changed compared to undergrad, where in undergrad, I think you have large moments of low stress and then it peaks really high during exams and it goes back low and you have this very high up and down situation, or at least that was my experience. Whereas, you know, with work, it's different where it's pretty consistent across the board, but on a consistent basis, you are more stressed than you would be in undergrad because you don't have this high low situation. It's pretty consistent and you get a lot less vacation time compared to how much you would have gotten in undergrad, where I used to get like a month off for winter break, a few weeks off for summer break. But I also didn't really like the high stress situation of finals. So I liked the consistency of work where it was like a 9 to 5 situation. It was very predictable. Like it wouldn't really change much from one week to another. And I think I really needed that after like going through undergrad and being through all the ups and downs. I think that structure and that consistency was really important to me. I would say in terms of the worst parts, I think one of the things that I didn't anticipate was there was some level of social isolation that I felt, especially because a lot of my support system was tied to the stuff that I did in undergrad. And so as people sort of moved back home as I moved a little bit further away from the student area in Berkeley, I did feel like it was a little isolating. And so I think I really encourage everyone, if you're thinking of taking a gap year, really build your support system because that'll be really important when you're applying to school as well, when you're waiting to hear back from schools and when you're working through your applications. I think having that support system is really important. And so I think that aspect of undergrad I did miss out on, is just being able to, you know, see people all the time, be surrounded by friends. And so like I lived with like 13 people when I was an undergrad and I lived with one housemate during my gap years. And so like being used to such a high level of just being surrounded by people and then having that change and be taken away during my gap years was a bit difficult. And so that's just something that I would say is make sure that you like build that support system during your gap years because it'll be really helpful, especially when you're going through applications.
Yeah. Oh man, there were so many best parts. I just think it was the best thing. I would say for me, overall, my stress level was never lower than it was during my gap years. Um, and I think that's good. Yeah, I went to like a very demanding high school, like prep school situation, and then a very demanding university. I felt like I was constantly stressed during school, even when there wasn't an assignment like a final right around the corner. It was always looming. So my anxiety assured that I was always stressed. But work wasn't like that at all. I mean, you're paid to be there for a certain amount of time. You're paid to be there. So that's nice. You're not paying to be there. And you can take control of your own life and your own schedule in a lot of ways. So, having free time is like, it's true free time. Like, you're not thinking about the homework that you need to get done. You're not constantly thinking like, oh, I'm watching TV right now, but I really have to finish writing my essay. Like, it's not there because you're going to go into work the next day. So it's like true free time. And that was something that I had never experienced and is now gone in medical school for sure, because there's always something looming. The worst thing about the gap year was having to navigate workplace dynamics. Workplace dynamics are really hard. They are, if you're working in a medical setting and you're a woman, they're even harder. And that was like an unfortunate realization that I sort of came to when I was working, was that like it was harder for me than some of my other colleagues. And so that was definitely the hardest part, was figuring out how to stand up for myself while not like overstepping the boundaries of the hierarchy that you're working in. But ultimately, I think that that's a really good skill that I came in contact with, because like Vishnu was saying, like hierarchy in medicine is something that we're going to deal with for the rest of our careers. So the bad was a good exposure to a problem that I'll have to deal with in the long term. So that was the hardest part.
Those are both very insightful responses. Thank you for that. I probably don't have too much original thought to add on to that, but I will second the idea that having that time just as a break from sort of the hecticness that is undergrad before the hecticness that is med school definitely is an opportunity to recharge the batteries and whatnot, because burnout is real. It is very real. And the road that you are entertaining right now as a pre-med is a long one, and one that sort of goes very far into the future. So definitely having a time where you can just sort of relax, like really truly relax. Like, ask yourself, when was the last time you truly felt relaxed? And it probably wasn't winter break, because you're pre-med. So the gap year or years are certainly opportunities for that. For me, I think the bad part about it was probably it was too short. I think the half a year could have been extended, and I would have gotten some good out of it. But nonetheless, it was still enough time to recharge. So I think at this point, what we'll do is we'll move over into the open Q&A. And usually we have, like with the webinar style, we have the Q&A box, and then we can either have specific answers types for people that have situations more specific to them, or we'll answer ones live. But since we have the weird Zoom problems going on right now, what we'll do is we'll just sort of revert to the Google Doc. So I'll paste it again. If you have any questions, definitely just sort of throw it up onto that Google Doc. But we'll just sort of go through them as time permits. So one of them was asking about sort of, I think we touched on this very briefly, but perhaps some additional explanation would be good, is explaining sort of the reasoning behind a gap year or years, in particular, if an interviewer thinks that it might be a negative part of your application. Like, what do you do to sort of make it part of your story?
I think the rationale is, I mean, there are several reasons that a gap year I think is really helpful. I think to be able to earn money, be exposed to the workplace and working full time and the nature of that versus being a college student. But I think it is also a really good opportunity to, like I said, pursue things that you hadn't pursued before. And so there are definitely ways to incorporate what you had done in undergrad, or to build on what you had done in undergrad during your gap years, and to present, that as an even stronger narrative during your medical school applications. And so I think when you're going through your gap years and when you're, doing these activities, I think really being purposeful about how it adds to your overall narrative and, why you're really interested in what you're doing. I think that's the important part. And if that can come across during an interview or in your application, I think that's the most important thing.
I think one thing I'll also add to that, which is something that like no one ever told me before I went into the interviews, but I wish I had known, was that it's fine to be honest about why you took your time. Like if you're comfortable sharing. So part of the reason why I took as much time off as I did is because I had a really hard time with my mental health during college. And I needed to take the time to refresh and take a minute. And I told my interviewers that, and not one of them balked at that response. They all were like, well, that makes a lot of sense. I don't understand why more people don't take gap years, how people can go straight through from undergrad to whatever. Like, that's what every single interviewer that I spoke to told me. So, just looking at this question, whatever your reasons are for taking your gap year, whether it's simply because, oh, I wanted to do it, or you have a reason where you need to take that time, like those are all acceptable answers. And I don't think that you should shy away from telling people exactly why you did. And then, once you speak honestly, then you can tie it into your overall narrative. Then you can say, and it was great that I did it because here's my narrative and here's how it works. But the more honest you can be, the more genuine you will sound. Whereas if you just kind of immediately skip to like figuring out how to weave the perfect narrative through, like everyone knows that that's not how life works. So everybody's got their own reasons why they took their time, and you should feel empowered to say what your initial impetus was and then how it has transformed as you've taken your time. Yes.
And that is so insightful, and thank you for sharing that story. I would completely agree with that. I think like there's sort of a feeling as a pre-med, like you have to sell yourself in a certain light in order to get sort of a good interview or get favorable sort of evaluations on the part of sort of the faculty that you're talking to. And really, I think honesty about sort of why you have done the things that you've done is really sort of one of the most important things, because that's going to make you come across as an authentic, genuine person. And these interviewers have been doing this for a very long time, and they can tell very easily if someone is like trying to spin something in a sort of a little bit of a false light or something like that. So I would completely agree with what Emma said, that any reasons that you have, definitely don't feel like you have to morph it into something that someone's expecting. Certainly whatever it is that you have done, like that's the most important part. We also have a question related to sort of the logistics, and I think this is a very good one as well, because with people that apply straight through, sort of the timeline is pretty logical. But with gap years, it's like, oh, when should I ask for letters of rec? When should I take the Mcat? Should I do it beforehand? Like all those different questions. So maybe Vishnu, maybe we could start with the letters of rec. When did you ask for them, and sort of how was that process for you?
Yeah, that is such a good question. I can go into letters of rec and then also go into Mcat as well. But
Okay,
for me, I knew that, I was graduating spring of 2018, but I wouldn't really need them until spring of 2019 when I was applying. But what I did was I asked my undergrad professors, when I was still a student, like, hi, would you write me a letter of rec? And there were a couple that actually submitted it before I graduated. So I stored them in Interfolio, which is a really nice service that you can use to store your letters of rec and then submit them to, the medical school application service when you're ready. So I had a couple of people that already submitted it before I graduated, and that was great because that meant that the letter was there. And then there were a couple of others who said yes, and then they asked for information. I sent them the information 2019 application cycle. And then, most of them got it in before the deadline. There were a couple that I sort of had to nudge politely a few times in order for them to submit the letter of rec. And then, so like be very careful about that, especially if you're asking, an undergrad professor and you plan to take gap years. I would recommend, getting a verbal confirmation and then sending the information that they request promptly so that, you at least have that confirmation. And then just make sure closer to the deadline, just if you don't get anything or if you haven't heard back from them in a while, follow up and say, hey, just checking in. I think that's really important. Do it politely and don't send them several emails in a way that will seem annoying, but just know that fine line. With the Mcat, I would say after I graduated, I spent some time teaching part-time over the summer. And so I had time to study for the Mcat while taking on a relatively low stress job. And so I did that the summer right after I graduated. And so that way I wouldn't have to study for the Mcat while working full-time. And so that was nice because once I delved into full-time work, I was able to focus only on work for the first few months. But it kind of depends. I mean, different people do different things that work for them, and not everyone's plans are going to align perfectly that you're going to have that time set aside to study for the Mcat. So there are people that study for the Mcat while working full-time, and most of us were working full-time while doing our applications as well. And so, I chose to teach and take the Mcat during the summer just because I knew that I needed a little bit more time to study. But I know several people that didn't do that and were able to take the Mcat while working full time, and that also works fine.
That is what I would call an incredibly organized and forward-thinking approach to this, which is fantastic. Not the way I did it, though. Might have been easier if I had done it that way, but I did not do it that way. So yeah, you could also take the more disorganized approach, which is that you could wait, which is exactly what I did. What I will say about that is that the more time you take off from school, the less important school is in your application, right? Like if you've taken I took a full undergrad time off in between. So who I was when I was 22 and graduated was very different from me 4 years later, which meant that my letters of rec did not have to look the way that other letters of rec normally looked. So they always say like 2 professors, 1 science, 1 not. No, I did not do that. I had 1 professor from school that I was close with, who I kept in touch with. And then the rest were the clinical coworkers that I was working with over the 4 years because they knew me so much better. It was so much more relevant to my application. So what I'll say is that like, you don't have to follow the exact rules of the applications. Like, yes, you're supposed to get the general gist going, but the more time that you spend out, the more non-traditional that your application looks, the more non-traditional your application can be. So for me, I didn't rely on those professors. And frankly, my professors didn't know me anyway. I mean, I was like in huge lecture classes, like they didn't know me. So I had the 1 science professor that I got close with, and then everybody else was like my clinical coworkers. And it worked out just fine. Not a single school said anything to me about that. And I applied to like 25 of them. So it was fine. So that's what I'll say. And then about the Mcat, yeah, I think with the Mcat, like probably the best thing to do is that the closer you take it, the better. But it does expire after a certain period of time. So you have to be, and it's completely disorganized across different programs. It's not like the LSAT where it's like 5 years and it expires universally. Every medical program sets their own deadline for how long the Mcat is good for. And it's around 3 years, but for some it's 3 years before application, for others it's 3 years before matriculation. So it's complicated. So what I will say is only take the MCAT if you are absolutely sure that you are going to be applying to all the schools that you want within their given time frame, which is why I waited to take mine, because I wasn't sure how long I wanted my time out to be. And so my studying was probably harder that way. But, you know, I mean, it ended up working out. But I did have a friend who took hers and wasn't able to apply to like a really solid number of programs that she would have applied to otherwise because her MCAT score had expired. So don't get to the point where you're 3 years down the road after your MCAT and then you can't apply to like half of the programs in the city that you're living because your score doesn't. Like, be Vishnu organized just with that thing. that part's better. So yeah.
That's all very good advice. And I think the only thing I'd add on to that is if you ever have questions about sort of the timeline, or like if there are specific rules that should apply to you, or sort of like how Emma was talking about how things might change depending on what your gap year years look like, you can always reach out to the administrations of the schools themselves, and you will be surprised at how forthcoming that the admissions office can be in sort of making sure that you are up to date with sort of all of their policies and whatnot. And that advice goes for sort of all aspects of the application. If you have questions about if your MCAT score is like competitive for that school, I emailed one school to say like, hey, this is what I have. Is this like in the realm of being competitive, or should I just like not bother? And like, newsflash, I ended up taking it twice. But like you can ask questions to those admissions committees, and they'll be very forthcoming about that. So we have 8 minutes left on the clock, so we'll try to zoom through some of the remaining questions. Maybe for these ones, maybe one of you guys can take it. One of those is, how difficult was it to get into sort of the clinical research experiences if you don't have previous experience during undergrad?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I had no experience with clinical research. I would look at all these qualifications and they'd all say they were required about knowledge of IRB and REDCap entry and Encore, IRIS, and I had no idea what those acronyms meant. And so, you know, when you're applying, like say that you're willing to learn. That's really important. And, you know, I think it really depends across different departments and different managers. I think that there are some managers that will say, you know, I really need somebody with XYZ experience and I really need somebody like that. And there are other people who will say, you know what, I prefer a younger person who has the potential to learn. And then once they learn, those skills could be a really awesome contributor. So, you know, there's no one size fits all situation because there's so much heterogeneity amongst all the hiring managers out there and what they perceive prior experience to be, especially for these entry level or near entry level jobs. So for clinical research, you know, a lot of the work that I did, whether it be like data entry or scheduling patient visits or working directly with patients, working directly with PIs, sending emails left and right to coordinate things, those are general skills that you can also learn from work or experiences that are not in clinical research. So like I brought up my teaching experience during undergrad. I brought up the research experience that I did in economics, which was directly applicable to the skills that were necessary in clinical research. And so, you know, I didn't think it was a problem for me. But at the same time, if you do have prior experience, that is a plus because I think it does make you stand out amongst all the undergrads that maybe might not have that experience. So, you know, it wasn't personally a limiting factor for me, but prior experience doesn't hurt.
Awesome, thank you. And maybe Emma, we have one about sort of the difference between paid experiences versus unpaid experiences. Could you speak a little bit about sort of, did you get an impression that one was more favorable than the other?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it depends on the nature of the unpaid experience, I guess. It would be impressive to be able to do an unpaid experience for like a full year or something, to not have any sort of financial backing at all would be hard. So I just logistically. But if you can show that you've gotten a grant or a scholarship or something along those lines with that, then that's fantastic. Volunteer work is an important part of your application, and it shouldn't be looked over. I will say that I don't know anyone who took multiple years off and solely did unpaid experiences just simply because of the logistical aspect of it. And to answer, only because of that. I don't think that inherently an unpaid experience is less valuable than a paid one. It just will come with challenges. But if you're thinking about that in terms of like summer experiences or things like that, then absolutely not. Like having any experience over the summer, pretty much none of my summer experiences were paid. So I think having unpaid experiences is not inherently bad. It's just as long as you're showing that your time is occupied. That's the main thing. Like you don't want to be working an unpaid experience a couple of days a week and that's it for your entire year, because then that would be more of a gap year and less of an enrichment year. And I don't think that would be favorable. But inherently, no, I don't think there's anything wrong with the unpaid experiences as long as you fill your time and you can do it logistically.
Solid advice. Thank you. I will take a couple questions just by pure virtue of the fact that I've seen them multiple times in a lot of the one-on-one sessions I've done. One of them being sort of what aspects of the application process or gap years have changed because of COVID. So that is multifactorial. There's a lot of flexibility that the admissions committees are now sort of using when it comes to sort of the current cycle. And we don't really know what that's going to look like in terms of future cycles. So if you're now sort of thinking about starting gap years perhaps at the end of this academic year, then we have less of an idea of what that's going to look like. But I think the most important part is going to be showing that despite the challenges of COVID, you still were able to do something that A, you enjoyed, and B, that was productive, if it was in a gap year or during just sort of the academic year. And if you're able to show that those two criteria are met, then the time is going to be seen as well spent. And I don't think anyone would ever fault you for that. There also, like I said, there will be a lot of flexibility. So I think some schools for this cycle, Mcat scores, like people might be accepted before the scores even come out. And then they sort of take a retrospective look. And unless something is like horribly off from what they're expecting or hoping to see, then it really sort of becomes a non-factor. But I would say if you have more questions about that, feel free to reach out individually, and we can even sort of escalate that to some faculty members who might have a better idea. We do have some questions, and maybe I'll let you both take them, about sort of how or where would you recommend looking for gap year experiences, and what can I do now during the pandemic?
Looking is a tough one. It's hard for the sciences. I think this was like I'm not sure if this is a big thing at UCLA, but I felt like the fall of my senior year, everyone in the world was like going through consulting and tech interview things. And I was only wanting to go into the sciences. So I was just kind of sitting there with nothing to do because there's no like recruiters coming to campus looking for you. So you do have to like take a bit of an extra effort. What I did was I reached out to professors that I knew and trusted. I reached out to family friends who were physicians. I basically just like made person-to-person contacts, and then got people to send letters or inform me of positions that were opening up and things like that. And that's how I was able to find my job. So nothing super structured, but that was what I did.
Yeah, I'd say my experience was kind of the opposite, where for UCSF, they have their own website where they post all their jobs and you can apply through the website and upload your resume, your CV, your activities and everything through that website. And so like that may very well be the case for UCLA. I'm not entirely sure, but for those sorts of jobs, I'd recommend applying broadly. So, keep in mind, because it's easy to apply because you can just upload your stuff online. When I saw in the back end, when I started there and we were hiring new people, we were getting so many applications. And, UCSF has a filter where, the resumes that have words that match their words in the job description, those sorts of skills, apparently the system auto pushes them up. And so that was something that I wasn't aware of, but apparently some resumes were being auto filtered out or auto filtered in. So in those sorts of situations, apply really broadly, and also leverage, any connections that you might have. Ask people if they're hiring. Berkeley had a Facebook group for jobs and internships, which I'm assuming UCLA does too, like a Facebook group. And so, look everywhere and really apply broadly because jobs get a lot of applications. And so you really want to cast the net wide, because, job search is difficult. And admittedly, I had the privilege of not applying in the middle of a pandemic. So I know it must be stressful for all of you. So really make sure you apply broadly and ask around.
I will say also, just to add to that, so once I moved into my managerial role, I was responsible for hiring the research assistants. And so I was one of those hiring managers on the other end. The best thing that you could possibly do is reach out directly. Like if you're submitting through those portals, you could get lucky, but also there's a lot of groups that are not even looking at the resumes that are coming through those portals. My group was one of them. So the best, and I know that that's stressful to hear, but if you think about the type of research that you're interested in doing, like think about the institutions you might want to be in, think about some specialties or research that you might be interested in, find names and email them directly. And that's how we hired 2 of our research assistants, because they found my boss's name. They thought the work that she did was interesting. They emailed her directly and they sent their resumes in that email. So if you can find a name and find an email, and like, especially for UCLA, utilize the fact that you have a directory, like you can find someone and reach out to them. That's going to be your best chance for success in hiring, but it does require legwork.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I would not underestimate the power of cold calling or the email equivalent thereof. I think that's how I got involved in all of the research and opportunities that I was a part of. It was really like talking to someone after a seminar presentation or sending an email out of the blue. And you will get a ton of people who won't respond to your emails. You will get sort of a bunch of unread, or someone who says, oh yeah, I'm not actually looking for people. But there will be a few that slip through that are like, actually, let's set up a meeting. And you never know what can sort of blossom from there. And I realize that sort of that conversation is more tailored towards research. And if you're looking for things like jobs, some students that I have sort of mentored have really looked into volunteering for various like tutoring positions. And I think some of them might even be paid. So there are a number of tutoring tutoring programs sort of across the country that facilitate virtual tutoring. So that's something that can be done during pandemic. And you're still able to have a meaningful impact in someone else's life. You're just doing something productive and hopefully something you enjoy. So that's one option as well. And I think UCLA does have a number of sort of platforms that you can search for, both for opportunities both within the institution as well as outside of it, especially if you're sort of reaching the alumni phase for graduation. I think that wraps up most of the questions. There was one brief one about sort of whether gap years, having medical activities, is it preferred to have them versus not? I would say, again, as long as it's something that you find interesting, whether it's medicine or not, is really not going to be as important a factor as if it's something productive and interesting for you that makes sense to sort of your story. So I think that is all of the questions. I would ask for all the attendees to go to the agenda and fill out the feedback form. There's a link at the very bottom, and it should take like a minute, but it will sort of give us ideas on how to improve, but also it gives you a voice in determining sort of what are the future sessions you might be interested in. So we have kind of an idea of what things we might have, what are the things that we might have wanted to hear when we were in your shoes, but obviously times are different, you are different. So definitely feel free to give us any thoughts there. With that, I think we'll probably close. I will put my email. Yeah, I was just going to say, I'll put my email in the chat. Feel free to reach out individually. I would also encourage you to go to the MedMentors peer advising page, and you can sort of schedule a one-on-one meeting with one or many of the mentors on there as well. We also have a question page where you can submit like a random question, and that's something that I manage, so I'll get back to you as soon as possible. So let me just throw my email up, and we'll stick around maybe for a couple minutes if people have any last minute things. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Vishnu and Emma, for taking your time and sharing your stories with us. So nice to hear your experiences. And thank you to Christina as part of the Career Center for helping us with this session and sort of being a collaborator in this endeavor.